Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend, our global look at the top stories in the coming week from our Daybreak anchors all around the world. Straight ahead on the program, a look at some of the big announcements we can expect from Apple's latest product event on May 7th, and a look at earnings from the world's biggest entertainment company. I'm Tom Busby in New York.
I'm Stephen Carroll in London, where we're thinking about vote splits and inflation dynamics ahead of the Bank of England's upcoming meeting.
I'm Brian Curtis in Hong Kong. We look ahead to Chinese President Xi Jinping's trip to Europe. What does he hope to get from the EU?
That's all straight ahead on Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend on Bloomberg 1130 New York, Bloomberg 99.1 Washington, D.C., Bloomberg 106.1 Boston, Bloomberg 960 San Francisco, DAB Digital Radio London, Sirius XM 119, and around the world on BloombergRadio.com and via the Bloomberg Business app.
Good day to you. I'm Tom Busby, and we begin today's program with tech giant Apple, its latest product event, this Tuesday, May 7th. For more on what we can expect, we're joined by Mark Gurman, Bloomberg chief correspondent on global technology. So, Mark, thanks for being here. What do you expect to see on Tuesday from Apple?
Thank you for having me. So it's been about a year and a half since the last time Apple released new iPads. Right? That was October 2022. So they went the full calendar year of 2023 without a new iPad. That was the first time since the iPad was unveiled by Steve Jobs in 2010 where the company went a full calendar year without a new model. On Tuesday, that's going to change. The company is going to be updating its two highest-end iPads, the iPad Pro and the iPad Air. These are going to be quite significant updates. The iPad Air, for the first time, is going to get a larger screen size option. That's a 12.9-inch model, much bigger than the current 11-inch model. And for the first time, the iPad Pro is going to get an OLED screen. That's a crisper, more efficient screen technology. It looks much better that they've been using on the iPhone and the Apple Watch for years. So that's finally coming to the company's iPads.
Well, that's big. What kind of role will artificial intelligence hardware play in this?
So the new iPad Pro, at least, is expected to have an updated processor that will set the stage for AI enhancements that the company will roll out at the end of this year. So the iPad won't come out the gate with these new AI features, but it'll have hardware inside to be able to support a new slate of artificial intelligence enhancements when those are ready towards the end of the year with their operating system update.
Okay, so with the iPads, we're seeing a big change. We know that iPad, small compared to like sales of the iPhone, but still a significant change for Apple. And let's talk about what it means to Apple for the iPad. And is it a launching point for future iPhones? What works in the iPad?
Well, 5-6 years ago, the iPad was really peaking, and then it increased in sales again during the COVID pandemic when people were just sitting at home buying a bunch of stuff thinking they need these things. But now what you're seeing are bigger sales for the Mac, and you're seeing more people buying iPhones instead of iPads because the iPhone screen sizes have become so big. And by the way, they're going to make the iPhone screen size even bigger in September with the iPhone 16 Pro line. But the iPad certainly does have a place for some people. The problem is that Apple's veered from the original vision. The original vision of the iPad under Steve Jobs was all the features and goodness of the iPhone with a larger screen, better for viewing photos, better for watching movies. And then, about a half decade ago, they did this odd thing where they tried to make it a quasi-laptop replacement. They added support for trackpads. They added support for more pro applications. They released their own keyboard. They have that Apple Pencil stylus. And it's sort of this in-between device, right? It's past the point of being the simplistic future of the computer, and it's nowhere near a true laptop replacement. And that's problematic, being somewhere in between. That's probably the place you don't want to be. And so what they really need to do with these new iPads is pick a direction. We're long gone from the idea of these things just being a bigger iPhone. We no longer want them to be these in-betweener devices. We want them to be true laptop replacements. And with the improved hardware, the better screens, the larger displays in the iPad Air, faster processors, a new version of the keyboard and trackpad case I'm expecting, it makes a lot of sense that these things are going to be better for people who want to replace their laptops.
Is there also going to be a new iOS operating system that is included in these new iPads?
Well, the version of iOS that's coming with these new iPads is going to be a version of iPadOS 17, which came out last year. That's the current operating system. The next operating system for the iPad, that's going to be iPadOS 18. That won't be announced until June 10th, actually, at their developers conference. That will be the update that includes all those new artificial intelligence features. But that won't be released until sometime around September of this year.
And September also when we should see the iPhone 16, you said?
iPhone 16 launch should be in September as well, and those will be the larger displays, as well as a new button on the higher end models that you can control the camera, zoom, moving between video and photos from the side of the phone itself versus within the software.
Now, let's talk about the iPhone for a minute because that sounds great. But you've reported the need to maybe have a more affordable, mass market phone to compete against all these rivals in China and really grow the base of the iPhone. How close is that to a reality?
Well, I personally don't think that's going to happen under Apple's current management. You know, they're so strong in their principles. There's no belief internally from at least the management team that they should release a cheaper phone. This is something they've considered over the years. Personally, I think this would be a way to gain market share and push back against the issues they're having in China. It would help them grow in India, potentially build a business in Eastern Europe, other developing markets such as those in Africa and Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia. But I don't think they're going to do it, at least anytime soon. There certainly isn't one in development right now. The idea would be you go to gain market share, make probably no profit on the phone itself, make up for that on apps and other services, subscriptions. And then as the middle class expands in those developing markets, you're able to pitch those people who are already in the Apple ecosystem on more expensive, pricier iPhones where Apple could ultimately make its profit.
Oh, but this Tuesday, May 7th, Apple's latest product launch, all about new iPads. And our thanks to Mark Gurman, Bloomberg chief correspondent on global technology. Well, we move now to the entertainment and media company Walt Disney, with Disney reporting second quarter earnings this coming Tuesday. And for more on what to expect, we're joined by Geetha Raghunathan, Bloomberg intelligence analyst on U.S. media. So, Geetha, what are you expecting to see in Tuesday's earnings?
Thank you so much, Tom. So Disney actually is just fresh after winning a very, very contentious proxy battle. If you remember that whole showdown that they had with Nelson Peltz. They've gotten through that, and now they are really ready to focus on execution. So there's a whole range of initiatives that they've been working really hard on, which is cost cutting, increasing financial visibility, and also really working hard on kind of reinvigorating their content engines. And we look at this as catalysts. There's already been a change in sentiment, and we're going to continue to see that change in sentiment play out as they report their fiscal second quarter earnings. There's a lot of things to kind of look to. I think the two major things are, of course, going to be the parks business, where they've kind of guided to low teens growth in operating income, as well as the streaming business, where we are almost, Tom, on the brink of profitability, and that should really get investors excited.
Well, that's a big change. How has the return of Bob Iger really helped Disney in this direction, whether streamlining operations, more cost-effective, or just taking charge?
Yeah, I mean, he's been instrumental, Tom, in kind of really righting the ship, if you will, here. So obviously, when he came back, things were pretty messy, especially with regards to kind of the whole content pipeline and just, the whole series of missteps with their content, whether it was on the film side or even on the TV series side. Obviously, those things take a little bit of time, but I think what he has really managed to do quickly is to articulate a strategy with, the streaming business front and center, cost-cutting initiatives. They first started out with about $5.5 billion in cost savings per year. They've kind of then upped that to $7.5 billion. And then just overall kind of making sure that the business is on a really strong footing. So if you kind of look at Disney, yes, we tend to focus a lot on the TV networks, ESPN, and maybe some movies and then the studio. But if you actually look at the business profile, 70%, 65 to 70% of Disney's profit comes from its theme park business. And so what Bob has done, obviously, is they've kind of articulated a plan now to really reinvest in that business. It's $60 billion that they're going to spend over the next 10 years. And then with regards to the rest of the segments, kind of, again, make sure that, content, of course, is kind of the lifeblood here at Disney. So just kind of make sure that they have a strong content pipeline, which will then feed into everything else.
Well, that 70% of revenue at the and those theme parks never seem to be without tons of people. So that's good news. But let's go back to what you said about the streaming services and being close to being profitable. I know that Disney just made a deal with Kroger, the nation's biggest supermarket chain, for Disney Plus. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I mean, they are doing all these deals. And again, the main objective here, Tom, is to make sure that, subscriber momentum is maintained. But as you know, streaming is no longer just about subscribers. It is also about being profitable. We know Netflix has kind of really established the narrative here, turning out about, $8, $9, $10 billion in profit. Disney is going to be next. So they have lost tons of money, almost close to about $8 billion or so on their streaming business since launch. But the good news, and this is something that investors are excited about, is that this is really just on the cusp of turning profitable. It could very well have been in the quarter that they're about to report, or if not, it'll be in the next quarter. And the idea here is that it is going to keep getting more and more profitable. And we have a lot of catalysts on the horizon. So yes, you have subscriber growth, but I think more important than that is, price increases, which they are definitely going to implement going forward. And that will be bolstered by a really good content pipeline. They are also cracking down on password sharing, a la Netflix. And then, of course, they have the ad tier. And then with the integration of Hulu, you have multiple positive elements that are really kind of going to get this virtuous cycle going.
Do you think there's going to be any update on the sports streaming partnership with Fox and Warner Brothers that was talked about a few months ago?
Yeah, that is actually supposed to come out sometime in the fall. There have been, a couple of regulatory issues surrounding that. Yeah, probably. I mean, I think they are definitely going to be asked how far along they are in terms of the infrastructure and the setup, and if they're ready to kind of show a test version of that, which I'm sure they are, given that upfronts is coming up pretty soon.
Now, one last thing I want to ask you about is the studio division. Still suffering, like all of Hollywood, from those twin strikes last year. What can we look forward to?
I mean, they really had a pretty bad year last year. But the good news is they're really kind of back on track in terms of executing on creative. They're improving their studio output. So as you look forward to 2024, we do have kind of this refreshed content slate. We're looking at Inside Out 2 and Deadpool, both of which promise to be really big summer movies. But what we're really excited about is 2025. You have a whole array of what we think would all be blockbuster movies, whether it's Captain America, Snow White. So Disney is really getting its mojo back.
Yeah, a lot of 2s, a lot of 3s after those movie titles, but give the people what they want. Well, Disney's second quarter earnings out after the close this Tuesday, May 7th, and our thanks to Geeta Raghunathan, Bloomberg intelligence analyst on U.S. media. Coming up on Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend, a look at the Bank of England's upcoming policy meeting. I'm Tom Busby, and this is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend, our global look at the top stories for investors in the coming week. I'm Tom Busby in New York. Up later in our program, Chinese President Xi Jinping visits Europe. Will it help repair relations between China and the continent? But first, in the UK, recent hotter than expected inflation figures, coupled with a strong labor market, may have put the brakes on hopes that the Bank of England is poised to begin cutting interest rates. In the coming days, Threadneedle Street's decision makers will vote once again. So, will they stick with elevated borrowing costs or take the plunge? For more, let's go to London and bring in Bloomberg Daybreak Europe anchor Stephen Carroll.
Tom, stop me if you've heard this one before, but since the start of the year, traders have scaled back their expectation for interest rate cuts. Okay, that's been the situation facing many central banks around the world. In the UK, it's a mildly hawkish run of data that's giving some pause for thought, on top of what's been happening with central bankers elsewhere. CPI inflation came in at 3.2% in March in the UK, down from 3.4% in February. That was slightly ahead of the Bank of England's forecast, though. But BOE Governor Andrew Bailey didn't seem fazed and assured markets that things were still on track. We've been getting the market view of the rate path ahead for the UK with Hugh Gimber, Global Market Strategist at JP Morgan Chase Bank.
I think really what the market is grappling with here is, does the UK look more like the Eurozone or more like the US? Because I go back 12 months ago and the answer to that was categorically that the UK looked a lot more like the US economy, where you had the tightness of the labour market, you had much stronger inflation pressure. Whereas today, I think arguably it's a lot more Eurozone-like, where yes, inflation is still higher, but inflation is coming down. It's going to come down significantly further over the next couple of months as that energy household price cap reset kicks in. And so I do think the bank will be able to follow the path more like the ECB than the Fed. I personally think they start the rate cutting process in August. But again, we're talking about relatively modest adjustments to interest rates. And so for bond investors, the main message here is that you're playing for really clipping the coupon in government bond yields today, with the potential for capital appreciation if the economy slows much more quickly. But I don't see a kind of straight line lower for bond yields until we get much weaker economic data than what we have at the moment.
Do you think that Andrew Bailey is in a position to be able to give clear signals, given the sort of uncertainty that exists elsewhere?
No, but then let me, if I may, flip your question the other way around and say, well, should he be giving clear signals? No, he shouldn't, because all central bankers are struggling to read the inflation data, just as markets are, trying to predict over the next 1-2 months, are we going to get 0.3s or 0.4s is nigh on impossible in this current economic environment. And so I think the right approach for central bankers today is to take stock of the incoming data that they've seen, but try to keep that medium-term view, because they're trying to set policy here over the next 12, 24, 36 months. They shouldn't be swung around by just what the last 1 or 2 weeks of data has been telling them.
The Bernanke review, a missed opportunity? Yes or no?
Not a politician, Lizzie.
Could they have gone further? Yes, I think that it could. I mean, there is some useful points there in terms of trying to communicate more clearly. I think everyone would welcome more guidance from the Bank of England in terms of how they're seeing the economy. But do you want a dot plot in the UK, for example? I would argue no.
So that was Hugh Gimber, Global Market Strategist at JP Morgan Chase. It's worthwhile too thinking about how the Bank of England behaves versus its peers. Members of the Monetary Policy Committee have an advantage in that this meeting is coming just a week after the Fed's, when Jerome Powell signalled that they were further away from cutting rates than before. The European Central Bank has signalled strongly that it's planning to cut rates at its June meeting as it grows more confident that inflation is continuing to slow. So how will the BOE fit in to what's happening elsewhere? I've been discussing the outlook for the upcoming meeting with Bloomberg's chief UK economist Dan Hansen. I started by asking him what's changed for the BOE since its last meeting on the 21st of March.
I don't think a huge amount has changed, to be honest with you. We've had a few upside data surprises, but they were very, very small. And if you look at obviously the most important thing, what happened to inflation over the first quarter, it came in at 3.5%. The Bank of England's forecast in February, the last time it put a forecast together, was 3.6%. So we're a little bit below. But for me, actually, what's been most interesting is what policymakers have been saying, which is what you alluded to there. And we've had remarks from certainly Andrew Bailey and Dave Ramsden that are very much sort of moving in, I would say, the dovish direction. There's a little bit of uncertainty, I think, about what Hugh Hill did or didn't say in his speech, but I think the thing for us that we took away at least is that he said that there's been little news in the data, which is obviously clearly very important. So I think, to answer your question directly, whatever you believe sort of following the March meeting the bank would do, at least looking domestically, and we'll probably get onto the Fed in a second, there isn't much reason to change your thinking about when the first cut will come.
OK, well, let's deal with the Fed issue and we'll come back to the split on the committee in a moment. How much does the signals that we got from Jerome Powell that rate cuts look further away than they did before, how much does that affect the BOE?
So markets think it affects the BOE quite significantly. If you look at the way BOE pricing has moved, if you look at the way Fed pricing has moved, they've essentially moved in lockstep. So what's interesting is, I think, the comments that Bailey made about that the UK's inflation problem is more like a European inflation problem, so the problem facing the ECB, then it's like the US's demand-led inflation problem. And I sort of am inclined to agree with that, particularly this year. I think there's going to be this quite big divergence between the UK and US inflation story, mainly driven by energy, but that sort of spills through into the rest of the CPI basket. So I don't think the Fed going later is an impediment to the BOE. I think it can go before the Fed. And actually, one thing that the BOE's got to be really quite careful about is that it doesn't allow what's happened recently, so this tightening of financial conditions, to spill into the UK economy. And we've seen that affect some metrics in the economy already. If we think about house prices and the like, and mortgage rates, you know, the BOE needs to be wary of that. Everyone talks about the exchange rate impact of going earlier than the Fed, but actually what you also need to be worried about is allowing tighter financial conditions to affect your domestic economy when your domestic economy is already very weak.
What is your expectation now in terms of the inflation trajectory? I mean, when does the 2% target look likely to be hit? I
think in the next few months. I mean, it might not quite get there in April. I think May or June are pretty good bets for when we'll get to 2 or even below 2, in fact. So, I mean, one really important consideration, I think, when you think about that is that the bank will have the May CPI print before the June meeting. And I think it'll be very hard if you have a 2 or even particularly if you have a sub 2% CPI inflation print in your hand not to do something. So I think that for us is sort of the next few months of data after we get past this meeting, the data between the May and the June meeting are basically key, and I think that will set the tone for the rest of the year in terms of what the bank thinks it can or can't deliver.
We talk a lot about the Fed's influence over other central banks. What about the European Central Bank? If the Bank of England has a similar inflation problem in Andrew Bailey's eyes to the ECB, does that mean actually the ECB decision, which is widely telegraphed for June, is likely to influence the BOE decision?
Well, I think it will help that the ECB just chronologically goes first. So in June, their meeting is before the banks. So I think there will be a bit of cover there. As you say, Bailey has made that comparison to Europe more than to the US. And you take that alongside the fact that you will potentially have a very favourable CPI print in hand. I think the sort of cards are aligning for, we think it's June. A lot of other economists think it's August, but sometime in the summer for them to move. So I think, the ECB is I think it's an important thing for the bank to have a bit of cover there. The ECB's gone. There's no sort of reason for the bank to sort of sit on its hands.
What about the rest of the year then, after the kind of first cut that we're looking at in that summer period? Is it going to be kind of stop-start depending on the data, do you think? Or once we get a first cut, do we look like we'll be on a steady trajectory?
So it goes back to my answer to the first question, is that whatever you believed following even the February meeting, but certainly the March meeting, it feels like you should probably still believe something pretty close to that now. So we still have meeting by meeting, at least for a time, and that's a lot more aggressive than market pricing. I think for market pricing to be borne out, you would have to have quite some bumps in the road. But if you're sitting at sub 2% headline CPI inflation and services inflation continues to fall, albeit slowly, and you have to sort of expect it to fall slowly, it's not going to drop like a stone like the headline rate has. I don't see any reason why they can't move, as I say, at least initially meeting by meeting. I think there'll come a point, and I think it's around about the 4% mark, where they get a little bit concerned about where what we call the neutral rate is, so the rate that neither speeds up nor slows down the economy. But I think there is room between sort of where we are now and around 4% to potentially take out what they're calling restriction in the policy stance, and sort of basically ease the squeeze on the economy.
What are the risks to the inflation outlook that you'll be watching? I mean, you mentioned energy. We had that spike in oil prices, which has sort of receded now, so that seems to be a little bit out of the picture. But is it still energy the thing you'd worry about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's energy, and without wanting to sort of tout the speech too much, how Dave Ramsden sort of characterised the whole thing is that I just feel there's not enough weight being placed on the downside risk here. The way inflation surged in the UK, if you sort of go through the sort of mechanism, headline inflation surged, people saw that, they bid up their wages because the labour market was tight, and that is eventually fed through to services inflation, and high energy prices have pushed up services inflation as well. Now energy price inflation is in fact we're in disinflation, the headline rate is falling, you have to put some weight on the idea that mechanism goes into reverse and quite quickly. And I think Bailey and Ramsden, at least certainly in their comments, are sort of alluding to this, that you have to look forward a little bit more and not just be completely data dependent. And I think that actually goes to the crux of it a little bit, where the bank's reaction function has shifted a bit, not just being completely on every CPI print and hanging on that, but looking forward to say, look, this thing could unwind quite quickly, so we probably need to take a little bit of insurance out to ensure that we're not caught on the downside on the way down, because we don't want to make the mistake of being too slow coming out of this, having arguably been too slow getting to it in the first place. So that for me is the risk at the moment, and that's why it's probably sort of when we see what they say on their May meeting, they'll probably say the risks are broadly balanced to the outlook, which is sort of a big shift again, because they've been constantly emphasising the upside.
And just coming back to that vote split idea, what would get you excited in terms of a vote split if you saw
Any
it
vote
in this
split.
meeting?
Any vote split. No, we've put our preview out, and in that we say that we think Ramsden will join Dhingra in voting for a cut. I think that, or any more going for a cut, would get people excited. I think if you had an 8-1 again, which is what we had in March, and similar guidance, it wouldn't feel like we'd moved closer. It might feel at that point it had been pushed away a bit. So I think there needs, if it's going to happen in the summer, it needs to feel like it's coming closer, and a more dovish vote split or even a tweak to the guidance would be the things to look for on that.
Thanks to Bloomberg's chief UK economist, Dan Hansen. I'm Stephen Carroll in London. You can catch us every weekday morning here for Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, beginning at 6 a.m. in London and 1 a.m. on Wall Street. Tom?
Thank you, Stephen. And coming up on Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend, Chinese President Xi Jinping set for a trip to Europe. What could this mean for relations between Europe and China? I'm Tom Busby, and this is Bloomberg. I'm Tom Busby in New York with your global look ahead at the top stories for investors in the coming week. Relations between China and Europe have been chilly as of late, but with Chinese President Xi Jinping set to visit Europe in the coming days, can we expect to see a thaw in that relationship? Let's get to Daybreak Asia hosts Brian Curtis and Doug Krisner.
Tom, Chinese President Xi Jinping heads to Europe in the coming week. He's expected to deliver the message that China has more to offer Europe than the U.S. cares to admit.
Xi will be traveling to France, Serbia, and Hungary on a 5-day trip. Those nations are seeking investment from China, even as tensions mount. Relations have cooled over a range of issues, including trade, allegations around spying, and Beijing's support for Russia.
Even with ties slipping of late, it appears that both sides will probably try to woo the other. Sources tell us that French President Francois Macron will take Xi to a corner of the Pyrenees where he used to visit his grandmother as a child.
And Xi will likely again make this point. Affordable clean energy from China will help Europe fight both inflation and climate change. Here's Dan Tenkate, Bloomberg Asia EcoGov executive editor.
From China's perspective, they're like, look, the world needs a bunch of EVs, so there's no problem with us investing in these, and we can provide cheap cars for your people. So, the visit to Hungary is important in that because you have Chinese companies looking to set up factories there, and, governments that are happy to kind of have this investment from China to gain jobs locally and to have cheaper electric vehicles in their market.
Bloomberg's Dan Tenkate. Joining us now in our studios for further discussion on this is Jenny Marsh, the team leader for Greater China EcoGov, and Rebecca Chung-Wilkins, Bloomberg Asia government and politics correspondent. So as we heard there from Dan, it's going to be a little give and take. Jenny, let me go to you first. As Doug said, relations have gotten a little testier of late here than before. We have these EU probes on Chinese-made EVs and also medical devices procurement. So it might be tempting to say that this will be a tougher trip for Xi than usual. But after all, this is the president, and he's not going to face a lot of press, and the meetings will be at a very high level. What are we expecting?
Exactly, and you can add to that list that he's picked 3 countries in Europe which are already considered to be some of the more friendly ones. So, going to Serbia and Hungary, these are not 2 countries which are big critics of China's policy. Quite the opposite. They're sort of big fans of Beijing's investment into their countries, and he can use those countries to sort of showcase this is what engagement with China can offer to you. France is going to be sort of the most important stop. And in France, he's also going to have this trilat with Ursula von der Leyen from the European Commission. And so I think, that meeting, I think is Macron's way of saying that, yes, Xi Jinping is coming and we're throwing this big banquet for him and him taking him sort of this very personal childhood retreat. But at the same time, they're not going to shy away from some of the tougher questions. And, Xi sort of is the architect of this de-risking narrative language, which the US then adopted. So I think in that trilat in France on the first day with Macron and von der Leyen, you're going to expect the toughest probably conversations he'll have during that trip on China's industrial policy, on Xi Jinping's continued support for President Vladimir Putin, despite, the war in Ukraine grinding on and sort of, this propping up Russia's war machine, something which has been really pivotal in changing the shape of the China-Europe relationship in a way I think that people and officials in Beijing didn't really grasp at the beginning how consequential that was going to be. So, I think, yes, he's going at a time when probably relations between Europe and China have never been, or in decades haven't been quite so testy, and distrust is growing. But he's carefully curated this itinerary, I think, obviously to serve his interests best and sort of promote the narrative that he wants to tell on this trip.
What about what Xi may be attempting to do in terms of U.S. EU relations, and whether or not there's an opportunity for him to maybe insert a bit of a wedge here, Rebecca, and try to exploit some division? I mean, we know there's a tremendous amount of unity, but there are disagreements. And would Xi use this trip to try to capitalize on some of that?
Yeah, I think that's right. And just to take a step back briefly, the broader context here is that Europe and the European Union in particular has for a long time viewed itself as this sort of middle path. It has wanted to resist automatically siding with the US, not just because of its policy on China, but also because of how the European Union historically has viewed the US itself. It has not wanted to just automatically throw its weight in. But the Biden administration has worked hard to get its allies and partners on side to try and build consensus when it comes to taking a firmer stance on China, including, for example, picking up that de-risking language, moving a little bit, showing at least a little bit of give and take with the European Union stance there. But we have seen this steady drumbeat of probes and investigations into Chinese industries via the EU, and that has essentially taken EU policy much closer to the US.
Well, the inroad on cars, too, by China seems to have made a big difference. You've got this probe that's underway, and BYD has a plant coming in Hungary. We understand that it will take about 3 years to be completed. And a lot can happen between now and then. I mean, you'll get the result of the probe in the EU, and, that could be quite damaging. And this kind of 3 years out for a plan, it shows how difficult planning can be. A lot can change in 3 years, Rebecca.
A lot can change, but we do, for example, also have another Chinese automaker, Chery, taking over an old Nissan factory in Spain. We think potentially there could be announcements of more such car factory plans in Europe during this trip. So while China is still waiting to see the results of that probe, a probe which was actually backed by France, it's worth mentioning, China is still working very hard to try and at least prove that there are benefits, as Jenny points out, if you do engage. And the fact of sort of going and opening factories in European countries, creating jobs, driving some economic growth, may try and may ease some of those tensions and some of those anxieties. But it certainly is hanging over, I think, many Beijing companies' heads at this moment. It's worth saying too, though, that Beijing has very actively engaged in the debate over overcapacity with the Europeans. So, for example, these long comments from Li Qiang and President Xi Jinping when German Chancellor Scholz was in the country, quite different from the more sort of standard and sort of briefer comments that we had when US officials have visited Beijing and discussed the same topic.
Well, it's interesting you make that point, because recently German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was in China and addressing the issue of things like unfair competition, dumping, overcapacity. Jenny, are these perspectives that are uniquely German because of the German manufacturing economy, or do they expand more broadly across the European Union?
They expand more broadly across parts of the European Union and beyond as well. You know, Scholz's visit to Beijing came just a few weeks after Yellen had been in Beijing, also carrying the same message. And the US Treasury Secretary warned Chinese leaders at the time that the concerns that the US has on Chinese overcapacity are shared by lots of countries around the world. And so Scholz coming and he really echoed her message, almost to the word just a few weeks later, really sort of hammered that home. And that's sort of part of a broader sign too, that the European Union and the US, their China policies kind of now sort of coalescing into one joined up policy. Obviously, the big thing on the horizon is the US election. And if we do see President Donald Trump coming back into the White House later this year, he could take China policy in a whole different direction. He'd become much more hawkish, much more sort of unpredictable. And then I think the Europeans are going to have to sort of think if they still want to walk in lockstep with the US on their China policy. But for now, the two sides are very much in sync in how they're presenting their concerns to the Chinese. And that must be worrying, I think, for China. Two of these huge economic blocs both presenting the same concerns.
Yeah, let's go back to Dan Tenkate. We talked with him briefly about how Xi might be appealing to the EU to pursue a more pragmatic policy toward Beijing.
Xi views Macron as someone he can do business with, someone that is not inherently reflexively anti-China, that can stand up to the U.S. And kind of forge a middle path, and is kind of key to China's longstanding strategic aim, to kind of drive a wedge, essentially, and not be in lockstep with the U.S., particularly when it comes to export controls on key chips and other advanced technology that China would need to grow its economy.
So, Jenny, what are some of the bargaining points that Xi will bring to the fore?
It's going to be all about what China can offer France, particularly. I think this is where the Chinese like to sort of work to the advantage they have, which is, they can offer different countries different carrots within the European Union. So I think for France, it's going to be sort of what their companies can bring in terms of job creation and investment. We know from sources that Macron is specifically going to be asking Xi for investment in the EV battery sector. So, if Xi can say he's going to steer some of their sort of world-leading companies in that sector towards investing in France, that's very appealing for Macron. And I think if what they can then do is sort of work out these deals where it's much more of a JV, and so rather than importing Chinese cars into France, if some of these Chinese cars or goods can be made in France by French workers, then that helps to ease these tensions. But of course, there's kind of an irony here too, in that there's been some research showing as well that, these European companies now, which are actually behind the Chinese in terms of this type of new tech, they're now looking for tech transfer. So when these Chinese companies do set up base in European nations, there's also this idea and a risk on the Chinese side of sort of technology leak, where the Europeans are now trying to learn from the Chinese companies which are ahead. And that's just something which is quite fascinating to think about for a second, because just a few decades ago, the complete opposite was true, where it was, European companies in China and the Chinese trying to sort of learn from that tech and, steal it even perhaps to get ahead. Now, everything's sort of swung and the imbalance is so great in some ways that you have these European firms that potentially want to learn from the Chinese. And that's something I think that, Xi has to sort of work out how to balance.
Thanks to the two of you for helping us set up the meeting this week between heads of state in Hungary, Serbia, and France with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Jenny Marsh, Bloomberg team leader for Greater China EcoGov, and Rebecca Chung-Wilkins, Bloomberg Asia government and politics correspondent.
I'm Brian Curtis along with Doug Krisner. You can catch us every weekday here for Bloomberg Daybreak Asia, beginning at 8 a.m. in Hong Kong and 8 p.m. on Wall Street. Tom?
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Doug. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend. Join us again Monday morning at 5 a.m. Wall Street time for the latest on markets overseas and the news you need to start your day. I'm Tom Busby. Stay with us. Top stories and global business headlines are coming up right now.